First quick thing that I want to say, I want to remind everybody to read the Gloria Anzaldúa piece for next time and submit at least 3 words you had to look up to the vocab folder. I also want to remind people, too, that if you've already got 10 points in the vocab folder, you don't actually need to keep submitting words, but you will get extra participation points if you do, right? So, yeah, that'll up your participation grade, but you don't have to do it anymore. I have also graded your exploratory reflections. Overall, I was really pretty pleased with them this time. I think you guys did a pretty good job. Everybody improved on what they did last time. You were much more focused on particular quotes. You had better ideas. So yeah, I think these are going to make for stronger, like a stronger basis for paper 2 if this is what you choose to do for paper 2. I'll give you guys the directions for paper 2 next week. Does anybody have any questions about anything?
Is paper 2 the annotated bibliography or something?
The annotated bibliography will be part of it, yeah. So we're going to do paper 2 in stages. You're going to do a paper proposal. You're going to do actually the first thing is going to be the annotated bibliography when you've decided what you want to write on. Then you'll do a proposal, which will give me your kind of suggested thesis that I can comment on. And then you'll do a draft and then the paper. And the reason we do this is partly because breaking it up into pieces makes the whole thing a little bit less intimidating. And also, frankly, because this forces you to start earlier. And it's been my experience that when I just assign a draft and a final paper, like right at the end of the term, then everybody waits till the last minute to do it. Okay? Yeah, we're all aware of our habits, right?
I just did reflection too in like 2 hours. Because I was in a car all day long.
Uh-huh.
I wasn't in the car. I was at home not doing anything, but I still
Yeah.
did.
Well, and something like a 500-word reflection paper, right, you can do relatively quickly, right? That's not something that necessarily requires a lot of time. But a 2,000-word research paper does require a good, significant investment of time, right? It's something you can't do the night before. So this makes you start, and it makes you do the research first. So you get your sources and you evaluate your sources before you actually start writing the paper. That's what the whole process is designed to do, right? So does anybody have any questions about that or about anything else? Okay, then here's the first thing that I want you to think about today. And this actually kind of goes along with what we were just talking about. Take a few minutes to consider this, right? When there's work that you need to get done, particularly any kind of intellectual work, what is it that gets in your way? And just be honest about this, right? Just, think about it, write some stuff down. Think about what the most significant barriers are to you actually getting work done.
Write everything down and formalize it. But this is the assignment. The assignment is bigger for all practical purposes. Case analysis. Let's think about that. I mean, either merge the form for the case analysis with the research essay assignment.
Okay, so once you've got a couple of things that you think get in your way, what I'd like you to do is rank them in terms of which are the most significant obstacles and which are the least significant obstacles. Like which are the things that you could, like, by least significant, I mean the things that you could overcome with a little bit of willpower, a little bit more desire to get something done. And by more significant obstacles, I mean things that are outside of your control. So what have you got? What are some of the less significant things that get in your way? What are the things that you could have some control over if you wanted to?
TV.
Okay, TV.
Play my favorite show.
Okay. You could watch less television.
I have to turn my TV like off for me to do stuff.
Uh-huh. You know, I feel like since we switched to streaming services and don't just like have regular cable anymore, I find that I actually watch a lot less TV because I don't sit there flipping through channels.
Yeah. I'll find like Netflix and I'll watch everything on Netflix and I don't have anything to watch, but then I find another streaming.
Uh-huh, right. So what other things get in your way that you could have some control over?
My phone and people texting.
Okay.
That was my more significant.
Okay. So friends and social contacts get in the way, right? What else? What other things did you come up with that you could actually have some control over that get in your way?
My little brother has a Nintendo Switch.
Okay, video games. Now, what about things that you don't have any control over that get in the way?
My adorable.
Okay. Family. What else?
Everything else is my assignment.
What's that?
I said everything else that's not my assignment.
Okay. Can we break that down to something a little more specific, though?
I'll find anything in my room to distract me.
Uh-huh. But see, that kind of falls under that less significant category, because you're just looking for distractions at that point, right? What about, I'm just thinking about things that you don't have any control over, right?
Like the internet, fire alarm bills.
Okay. How often does that happen?
It's happened like 4 times.
Okay.
The whole year.
Okay, so yeah, sometimes you got an emergency you have to deal with, right?
Computer breakings by your father.
Yes. You had that little issue. Yeah, you have technology issues, yes, okay.
Neighborhood screen.
What other things might get in the way of your ability to get work done? And by work, I mostly mean like intellectual work, like classwork and assignments and things like that.
Your motivation. You don't know what to do.
What's that?
Like you don't know what the instructions for these.
Okay. Yeah, you get like sort of intellectual paralysis, right? Where where you had lack of understanding. Do any of you work full or part-time jobs?
I will be.
Okay. Yeah, and a job is a significant time drain too, right?
Yes, especially when you work all day long.
Yeah.
And you just want to sit in bed.
Yeah. Yeah, if you have to work at something else to make money, right? That takes away a lot of the time you would have to just kind of sit and think and or write, right? And the reason that I wanted to go through this is because this is kind of central to the issue that Woolf is getting at in this essay,
I
right?
really did not start to understand that until she was like, suppose Shakespeare had a sister, and like after that,
Yeah.
because I did not understand the first part. Like, she,
Uh-huh.
I guess the words were just like not connecting with me.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the argumentative strategy here, right? She lays out a bunch of ideas in the first part of the essay, right? And then she gives you an example of what this looks like, right? So she takes something abstract and makes it concrete, right?
Right.
So let's look actually at the story she tells her about Shakespeare's sister and what this suggests about why she thinks historically relatively few women have been writers, right?
Forgot the book. There was a together. You can sit right there with me. I just thought I'd
So let's start with her description of young Will Shakespeare on page 33. Can I get somebody to start reading from top of the page? Let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by.
I will.
Thank you.
Let me imagine, since facts are so hard to come by, what would have happened had Shakespeare had a wonderfully gifted sister called Judith, let us say. Shakespeare himself went very probably. His mother was an heiress to the grammar school where he may have learnt Latin, Ovid, Virgil, and Horace,
Uh-huh.
and the elements of grammar and logic. He was, it is well known, a wild boy who poached rabbits, perhaps shot a deer, and had rather sooner than he should have done to marry a woman in the neighborhood who bore him a child rather quicker than was right. That escapade sent him to seek his fortune in London. He had, it seemed, a taste for the theater. He began by holding horses at the stage door. Very soon he got work in the theater, became a successful actor, and lived at the hub of the universe, meeting everybody, knowing everybody, practicing his art on the boards, exercising his wits in the streets, and even getting access to the palace of the queen.
Okay, thank you. We can stop there, right? So, what do we learn from this picture of Will Shakespeare as a young man, right? What advantages does he have?
He's able to go to school,
Yep, he's got formal education, right?
right?
Good. What other advantages does he have?
He knows a lot of languages.
Okay, yeah,
I guess I would go with Flemish.
yeah. Right, all of the names that are listed there are Latin poets, so he's familiar with classical literature, right?
He was a wild boy.
Uh-huh. And are there any consequences for his wildness?
No.
Yeah. He poaches rabbits. He shoots a deer he's not supposed to. He knocks a local woman up, has to marry her really fast. But he doesn't have to stick around, right?
Right.
So he is able to avoid any serious social consequences for his, shall we say, youthful antics. Right? Nobody holds him accountable for any of this that he does, right? And then when he gets to London, what is he able to do?
Practice his wits in the streets.
Yeah, because he's a clever guy, right? He is able, through his wits, to work his way up in the theater world, right? Until, suddenly he's hanging out with the queen, right? So he has access to society and to work, right? Now let's look at the story that's told us about Judith then, afterwards, right? Now first, like, everybody gets that Judith Shakespeare is completely fictional, right? There was no such person. She's a product of Woolf's imagination. So can we start someone from the spot where it says, meanwhile his extraordinarily gifted sister, let us suppose. Go ahead, Ron.
Meanwhile, his extraordinary gifted sister, let us suppose, remained at home. She was adventurous and imaginative, as Agatha to see the world as it was. But she was not sent to school. She had no choice of learning grammar and logic, let alone reading Horace and Virgil. She picked up a book now and then, one of her brothers perhaps, and read a few pages. But then her parents came in and told her to mend the stockings, or mind the stew, and not move about the books and papers. They would have spoken sharply but kindly. They were substantial people who knew the conditions of life for a woman and loved their daughter indeed. More likely than not, she was the apple of her father's eye. Perhaps she scribbled some pages up in an apple loft on the slide, but was careful to hide them and set fire to them.
Okay, so let's pause there for a second, right? So what's the first thing we learn about Judith's upbringing as opposed to Will's?
She was like kept home.
Yeah, she's kept home, right? And what is he given that she isn't?
Formal education.
Yeah, she has no education, right? So any education she gets, she has to get for herself, right? By sneaking a peek at his books. And what else does she not have that is necessary for doing the kind of work and thinking one would have to do as a writer? Whenever she's caught with books and papers, what do her parents tell her to do?
Put them down and do housework.
Yeah. So what this means? So what does she lack then? What else is she not given
Freedom,
in addition to formal education?
access to society, and work.
Yeah, no real access to society, right? And no leisure time either, right? That's another thing that Will seems to have in abundance that Judith doesn't, right? Will clearly has time to himself because he can go around poaching rabbits, shooting deer, and sleeping with neighbor women, right? Judith doesn't have time for any of that sort of thing. Judith has to mend the stockings or mind the stew, right? Now let's continue here from soon, however, before she was out of her teens.
Soon, however, before she was out of her teens, she was to be betrothed to the son of a neighboring Woolf faithful. She cried out that the marriage was hateful to her, and for her that she was severely beaten by her father. Then he ceased to scold her. He begged her instead not to hurt him, not to shame him in this matter of her marriage. He would give her a chain of beads or a fine petticoat, he said, and there were tears in his eyes. How could she disobey him? How could she break his heart? The force of her own gift alone drove her to it. She made of a small parcel of her belongings, let herself down by a rope one summer night, and took the road to London. She was not 17.
Okay, pause there, right? So what happens here?
They try to marry her off and she says no.
Yeah. Yeah, Will is able to basically abandon his wife and child and go off to London, right? And nobody says boo to him. Judith is to be forced into marriage to someone that her parents have chosen, right? Probably for economic reasons. And all of this at the age of 16, right? So the only way she can avoid the hateful marriage is to simply run away, right? Pack up her things and go. And then when she gets to London, what happens to her?
She gets turned down by everybody
Yeah,
in the theater, except one man that her mentors.
yeah. She tries the same route to fame and success that her brother did, right? But the doors that were open to him are all closed to her. Right? The birds that sang in the hedge were not more musical than she was. She had the quickest fancy, a gift like her brother's for the tune of words. Like him, she had a taste for the theater. She stood at the stage door. She wanted to act, she said. Men laughed in her face. The manager, a fat, loose-lipped man, guffawed. He bellowed something about poodles dancing and women acting. No woman, he said, could possibly be an actress. He hinted, you can imagine what. She could get no training in her craft. So, why is it that she cannot find work in the theater?
Because that wasn't a woman's place.
Yeah, because she's a woman, she's barred from working in the theater. Now, I'm sure you all had to read some Shakespeare in high school, right? So, do we know anything about who played women's parts typically in, women's parts are played by men in Elizabethan plays. Usually, they were played by apprentice boys in the company whose voices hadn't changed yet. This is why there typically aren't very many female roles in a Shakespeare play, is because each company usually only had maybe 2 or 3 apprentices at a time. And then once their voices changed, they would graduate to adult roles, right? Or to male roles, right?
As long as they hit puberty,
Yep.
get on the big screen as a man.
Yep. At least, after you get over that period where your voice is cracking, and
Right.
then maybe they make you work backstage for a year or two.
Right.
Once you hit puberty and your voice changed, you would graduate to male roles, right? So yeah, adult actors played the male roles. So even that suggests that the female roles are somehow less significant. They're for apprentices, right? But yeah, because she's a woman, she can't participate in this world at all, right? And when this actor-manager, Nick Green, who takes pity on her, gets her pregnant, she can't run away from that, right? So she commits suicide. Will could run away from his wife's too early pregnancy, right? Judith can't, right? Physically impossible to do so. So rather than bear a child out of wedlock, she kills herself. So the basic point that Woolf is trying to make here, right? What she's trying to do is explain why, in an age that produced men of genius like Shakespeare, there are few, if any, women of genius, right? What she's trying to do is provide a picture of women's lives that demonstrates what would have kept them from achieving the same kinds of things. And what we can see here is that Judith's life and choices are a lot more constrained, right? It's nothing to do with her. She has the same, not only is she equally talented, right? She has the same talents her brother does. But he's given the scope to employ them and she isn't. So, to give you a little bit of context here, this is excerpted from a book-length essay called A Room of One's Own. And the basic argument that Woolf is making in A Room of One's Own is that in order to be a writer, a woman needs a certain set of things, right? Like needs all of these things, right? First, needs privacy.
A room of her own.
Yeah, exactly. You need a space in which to write where no one's going to bother you, right? So yeah, this refers to both space and time, right? You also need an income. Right? Preferably one for which you are not dependent on someone else, right? So this would be one of the things that Judith Shakespeare lacks, right? It's like she lacks, well, one, she lacks privacy, she lacks the space and time to develop her talents. She also lacks any independent means of making money, right? And yeah, these are the major elements for Woolf of intellectual life, right? These are the things that make intellectual life possible. And she argues that these have historically been denied to women, right? In particular. Because what in particular are women's space and time usually filled up with, historically speaking? Yeah, housework and kids, right? Now, you are all probably too young to have had this particular experience, but I know I have a lot of colleagues and I've had former students who were mature students who just couldn't get a lot of shit done because their kids were always bugging them, right? This is something that we're seeing people complaining about a lot in the pandemic, right? Is that they're expected, if they're working from home, to produce just as much as they would if they were in the office. But a lot of people are also at home taking care of kids and trying to make sure that their kids are keeping up with school and making sure the kids are fed and washed and cleaned and entertained, right? And not breaking in upon them during meetings and things like that. So child care is a huge drag historically on women's time, right? As is, as you said, housework. And it's only relatively recently that it's not necessarily recent that women have worked for pay, right? This is something that, working class women in particular have had to do for, quite some time, right? But the idea that, women would be working in, say, like white-collar professions after they're married, right, that's relatively new. So the whole idea of women having an independent income, essentially, like, who would that, in Woolf's time, in, say, like the 1930s, 1940s, what kind of women would have enough of their own money to be able to make a career for themselves as a writer?
Maybe like widows.
Maybe, yeah, widows.
I said something.
Yeah, she said something way
No, you'll say. It was the first thing that popped in my head.
What did you say?
I said hookers.
What's that?
Hookers.
Well, but again, there's the time issue there, right? Oh, it is actually it's interesting that you say that, because that was actually one of the ways working class women tended to choose to get out of the working class, right? It was actually, you made better money and had more independence than if you worked in a factory.
Yeah.
And you were, less likely to like die of lockjaw or get mangled
Now
in a
you just
machine.
die of AIDS.
Yeah, well, it was the bigger risk then was syphilis. But yeah, still, yeah, a lot of people consider that risk preferable to the risk of getting your limbs mangled in a machine. So,
I know which one I choose.
yeah, I mean, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, right? But yeah, by and large, yeah, I think you're on the right track when you talk about widows being the people who have enough income. Essentially, we're talking about writing as a profession being limited to rich women. Because they would have servants to run the household. If they have, what's that?
Servants to watch their kids.
Exactly, yeah. They might be, particularly if they have their own money, if they inherited it, they might be less dependent on a husband for income, right? And in fact, I think one thing that's kind of interesting to note about the Shakespeares here, right? Where does the money, from which parent's family does the money come from that they can use to send Will to school?
The mom, she's an heiress.
Yeah, his mother's an heiress, right?
Yeah.
So because his father married up, right? They're able to send their son to school, yeah. And I think that there's an interesting little irony in Woolf's little story here, that it's the mother's money, that
Yeah.
Will actually is dependent on a woman for his education and his start in life.
Right. I didn't catch on that, but good job.
Well, this is what I've spent most of my adult life doing, so.
Yeah.
So, let's kind of go back to the parts of this that you said you found a little more confusing and see if, in light of this concrete story of Judith Shakespeare, we can make a little more sense of this, right? So, I want to look in particular at the metaphor that Woolf sets up in the second paragraph on page 30, because this reveals to us a lot about how she's thinking about this issue. And so can I get somebody to read that second paragraph for us on page 30, starting with "For it is a perennial puzzle." Thank you.
For its perennial puzzle, why no woman wrote a word of that extraordinary literature when every other man, it seemed, was capable of a song or sonnet? What were the conditions in which women lived? I asked myself. For fiction, imaginative work that it is not dropped like a pebble upon the ground. As science may be, fiction is like a spider web attached over so lightly perhaps, but still attached to life at all four corners. Often the attachment is scarcely perceptible. Shakespeare's plays, for instance, seem to hang there, complete by themselves. But when the web is fully spun, hooked up at the edge, torn in the middle, one remembers that these webs are not spun in midair by
Incorporeal.
incorporeal creatures, but the work of suffering human beings that are attached to grossly material things, like health and money and the houses we live in.
Okay, so does anyone know what incorporeal means?
No.
Okay, so something that's incorporeal is something that's bodiless, right? So, what is being compared to what here?
Like stuff being compared to spider webs.
Pardon?
Things are being compared to spider webs. Like
Yeah.
fiction.
Something's being compared to a spider web, right? What is like a spider web?
Fiction.
Yeah, fiction is like a spider web. Good. And how are these two things similar to each other?
Like it spreads out the four corners.
Yeah, and can a spider web just hang there in midair?
No.
Yeah, it has to be anchored to
No,
something,
it looks
right?
like it.
Yeah, a spider web has to be anchored to something material, right?
I'm so glad I did not forget deodorant.
What was that?
I said I'm so glad I did not forget deodorant this morning.
I always do.
I usually do.
I feel like I don't come here anymore, so.
I'm glad we're all taking care of our hygiene. That's good. That's important.
Trying our best.
But yeah, a spider web has to be anchored to something real, right? Something concrete. And what she's suggesting here is that, right, so does fiction, right? So does any kind of imaginative work. That you can't just, like, it doesn't come out of nowhere, right? It has to have its roots in real life. And I think it's important also to note which historical era she's talking about. The Elizabethan Age, yeah. So, does everybody understand what that means? What she's referring to when she talks about the Elizabethan Age?
Like when Queen Elizabeth, one of them, was
Yep.
the queen. And
Yep.
how everything,
I was the queen.
What's that?
And I was the
Yes, when you were queen in England in the 16th century, yes. So yeah, she's talking about the Elizabethan Age, right? So the reign of Elizabeth I. So this is important in part because it is like, you know, there's a great big explosion of creativity in English literature here, right? You know, this is the age of Shakespeare and all that, plus, you know, Edmund Spenser and Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson and, you know, dozens of other playwrights and poets. But what else, given Woolf's argument, seems potentially significant about the Elizabethan Age?
that a woman was ruling.
Yeah. Yeah, England is ruled by a queen, not by a king.
Yes.
So one might expect, right, that with a woman on the throne, things might be better or different for women, right?
It wasn't.
But it's not. Yeah. Yeah, this is the big thing that she notes from looking at the histories is that this is still a pretty lousy era in which to be a woman, right? I went therefore to the shelf where the histories stand and took down one of the latest, Professor Trevelyan's History of England. Once more I looked up women, found position of, and turned to the pages indicated. Wife beating, I read, was a recognized right of man and was practiced without shame by high as well as low. Similarly, the historian goes on, the daughter who refused to marry the gentleman of her parents' choice was liable to be locked up, beaten, and flung about the room, without any shock being inflicted on public opinion. Marriage was not an affair of personal affection, but of family avarice, particularly in the chivalrous upper classes. Betrothal often took place while one or both of the parties was in the cradle, and marriage when they were scarcely out of the nurse's charge. That was about 1470, soon after Chaucer's time. The next reference to the position of women is some 200 years later, in the time of the Stuarts. So, this great big gap she notices in anything that this history book has to say about women is right here. Professor Trevelyan's history book tells her absolutely nothing about women in the Elizabethan Age. It tells her about how women were beaten in the prior century and about, you know, how they were married off to whoever their parents chose for financial reasons. And then it doesn't really say anything about them again until the following century. It was still the exception for women of the upper and middle class to choose their own husbands, and when the husband had been assigned, he was lord and master, so far at least as law and custom could make him so. Yet even so, Professor Trevelyan concludes, neither Shakespeare's women nor those of the authentic 17th century memoirs, like the Verneys and the Hutchinsons, seem wanting in personality and character. So, what's the irony that's being pointed out here? What is Professor Trevelyan noting about the women of Shakespeare and of these 18th century memoirs?
Like, not a lot has changed. Maybe.
Well, Shakespeare's plays are actually kind of full of strong and willful women, right? You know, he makes the kind of backhanded compliment that these women of Shakespeare's plays are not lacking in personality and character, right? Nor are the women of these 18th century memoirs. But I think part of the point here is that there's a gap between women in literature and women in real life, right? That the women of these plays and these memoirs, which are mostly written by men,
It's not a true portrayal of how women actually are.
yeah. And, you know, she notes at the end of this paragraph here, right? Indeed, if women had no existence save in the fiction written by men, one would imagine her a person of the utmost importance. Very various, heroic and mean, splendid and sordid, infinitely beautiful and hideous in the extreme, as great as a man, some think even greater. But this is woman in fiction. In fact, as Professor Trevelyan points out, she was locked up, beaten, and flung about the room. So a big part of the point here, right, and I think kind of what we get to when we're talking about the story of Judith Shakespeare, right, is that in order to get any kind of picture, the only picture we can get of women's lives in the Elizabethan period is an imaginary one, right? Because there's so little information available about what women's lives were like. And most of the information that is given is about their relationships with men, right? And how men were basically allowed to kind of do whatever they wanted to them. So, where are we for time, by the way?
108.
108. All right, we're good. So, can I get somebody to read the paragraph that follows on page 31? The first full paragraph that starts with, a very queer composite being thus emerges.
I'll read it. A very queer composite being thus emerges. Imaginatively, she is of the highest importance. Practically, she is completely insignificant. She pervades poetry from cover to cover. She is all but absent from history. She dominates the lives of kings and conquerors in fiction. In fact, she was the slave of any boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. Some of the most inspired words, some of the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips. In real life, she could hardly read, scarcely spell, and was the property of her husband.
Okay, so sit with this paragraph for a minute, right? It's organized into binaries. I want you to try to pull out and break down some of these binaries, right? Where do we see expressions of opposites here?
She pervades poetry from cover to cover. She is all but absent from history.
Okay, so what are the opposite ideas here? Or the ideas that are being opposed to each other?
What does pervade mean again?
To pervade is to run all the way through something, right? So if something's pervasive, it's everywhere.
So So she reads poetry cover to cover? Is
Uh,
that what it's trying to say?
not that she reads it,
But
she
she's in it.
pervades it. She's in it, exactly. Yeah.
She's all absent. She's all but absent from history. Like, she's in the history.
Uh-huh.
But then it's like, in fact, she was a slave of any boy whose parents forced a ring upon her finger. So, like, she's there, but, like, she's not there.
Yeah, I think pervasive versus absent would be one binary we think of. So there's one thing that she runs all the way through here, that she's all over. And then there's another field from which in which information about her is completely unavailable, right? And so, where is she pervasive?
In poetry,
In poetry, yeah. Okay, good. And from what is she absent?
history.
Yeah. So poetry and history seem to be at odds here too, right? You know, we've got our, supposedly accurate picture of the past. Juxtaposed against imaginative constructs, right? Imaginative literature. Okay, good. So where else do we see binaries in this paragraph? I just want to try to pull all these out and try to figure out how they work together.
The last sentence, some of the most inspired words, some of the most profound thoughts in literature fall from her lips.
Uh-huh.
In her life she could hardly read, scarcely spell, and was property.
Okay. So how would we maybe break that down into two words that are opposites? One thing we might suggest is literature versus reality, right? Which seems to go pretty well with our poetry and history binary. But what else can we pull out of that sentence?
Some would like her being the property of her husband. Or like how
Okay, yeah,
it's
so-
like literature fell from her lips, but she can hardly read or spell.
Yeah, so on one side of this we got maybe, would ignorance be a good word for it? And then how would we sum up the other attitude you're talking about there with, poetry falling from her lips and inspired words and profound thoughts?
Educated.
Okay. Intelligence, inspiration, education, right? Yeah. At any rate, it seems the suggestion here seems to be that the woman of literature is profound and inspiring, right? Whereas the woman of reality, at least in described in these histories, is kept in the darkness of ignorance. Now, can we note here any similarity between what Woolf is doing and what Frederick Douglass was doing? If we think back to what we talked about last time.
I mean, I know that Frederick Douglass said, like, being educated was, like, one of the worst things that happened to him because it, like, made him realize a lot of stuff. So,
Uh-huh.
Maybe
At-
that could be for women.
Yeah, but for Douglass, education is both freedom and misery, at least at first, right? Because it's only when he recognizes his own state that he starts to become upset, right? But yeah, I think that would Woolf seem to agree that education can lead as easily to misery as to joy or to freedom.
I don't want to say yes or say no.
Well, say whatever you think if you and try to back it up.
I don't know, like Judith was smart,
Yeah.
in all of her own ways, but couldn't do nothing with it.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, back
Yeah.
then it would be like kind of like a waste.
And she gets her education in a lot of the same way Douglas does, right?
Teaching herself.
Yeah, in little bits, teaching herself when nobody's looking. So, I think, you could certainly make the case that at least the way society is set up, right? Education for Judith ends up being a disaster because it allows her to imagine something beyond her condition, right? Now, Douglas is able to use his education to forge his pass and get himself to freedom, right? But Judith doesn't have that option.
Right.
I think there is also here kind of like another binary within this paragraph, though, that is also relevant to Douglas's piece. There is also a master-slave dichotomy here, though here...
See, I was going to say something about enslaved,
Uh-huh.
but like
So yeah, well, you're getting it. You're thinking along the right lines, right? So, and who is the master on this side of the binary? The literature, inspiration, imaginative side of the binary. If we're talking about imaginative woman or woman in fiction.
rich.
Yeah, I mean, well, when we're talking about this side, we're not talking about real women, right? So, on this side of the binary, woman seems to be the master of language and able to get, man to do whatever she wants and so on and so forth, right? Speaker of profound thoughts. But yeah, this is women who have been created
By man.
by men, yes.
Oh.
And these are women as they actually exist
life.
from what we know about history, right? But then what's one of the basic problems with history that she points out when it comes to women?
It's written by men.
Yeah, it's mostly written by men, and by and large they don't seem to show much interest in writing about women's lives, right? Women are barely mentioned in the histories written by men. So if we look on the next page, right, the bottom of the first paragraph there, right, says, that moment, however, that one tries this method with the Elizabethan woman, right, imagining her as a real person, one branch of illumination fails. One is held up by the scarcity of facts. Now let's try to bring this back to the spiderweb metaphor, right? Why did Woolf think fiction was like a spiderweb?
Is it branched out?
Pardon?
Is it branched out?
Yeah, it branches out, right? But it also has to be rooted in fact, right? It has to be tied to material reality in some way. You have to anchor that spider web on all four corners or it's just going to blow away. And so it becomes difficult to imagine even how this Elizabethan woman is constructed because of this scarcity of facts. We've got nothing to anchor our reading of Elizabethan woman to. All these facts lie somewhere, presumably, in parish registers and account books. The life of the average Elizabethan woman must be scattered about somewhere. Could one collect it and make a book of it? It would be ambitious beyond my daring, I thought, looking about the shelves for books that were not there, to suggest to the students of those famous colleges that they should rewrite history, though I own that it often seems a little queer, as it is unreal lopsided. But why should they not add a supplement to history? Calling it, of course, by some inconspicuous name, so that women might figure there without impropriety. So, are the facts that she's looking for not exist? Is there no way to learn these facts?
I mean, yes and no. You have to find the right book, or you know.
Yeah. What do you have to? What would someone have to do to learn these facts?
You have to rewrite it.
Okay, yeah, they.
One that was like, you know, I don't know, edited to, you know, add that one part that was left out before.
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're thinking along the right lines here, right? The problem isn't that the facts aren't out there, right? It's that no one has bothered to compile them and write about them, right? So, we're talking about women in literature that's been written by men, but also in histories that have been written by men, right?
So like, they find like a little snippet of this in like the whole bigger part of history, when like, you know, this could have like been a whole other book. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, the history of 51% of the human population, right, is basically ignored. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's not that it's not recorded in places, right? It's that the historians don't bother with it.
It's also like that one story we read where they keep stuff out of history lessons so their democracy isn't lost or something.
Oh yeah, the whole the Martha Nussbaum essay, right? Yeah, exactly. That whole thing about keeping stuff out of history classes so that students don't question the received narrative, right? So that they just kind of learn to be obedient. Yeah, and I think that that we can connect that to the expectation of women's obedience that seems to be encoded in what she says about history here, right? But yeah, I think part of the point here, part of the argument is that both of these women are written by men and reflect the concerns of men. They're not written by women, and they thus do not reflect women's interests and concerns, right?
I'm gonna have to go to the shade too quick before I sweat.
Okay, well let me,
Glasses.
if we're all gonna head over this way, let me turn this around and reorient. If this will stay up.
Oh, well, we told you. No problem. Sorry for the people watching.
It's an unavoidable hazard
Yeah.
when we're outdoors. You know, I generally expect that when we're outside, you're going to pay a little bit less attention than you do when we're inside.
I was looking at the shade for a good minute. I'm like, that feels so good under there.
I heard a bird, a bunch of
Yeah.
bugs were landing on me. I'm like, bugs hate me.
Yeah, my wife has the same problem. Like, bugs will completely ignore me, but are always
Yes.
landing on her.
Ignoring her, but they were all landing on me. I
Uh-huh.
saw a spider was on me. Oh, no, thank you.
Okay, where are we for time?
1:24.
Okay, so where was I before I moved to the board? What were we talking about?
Written by men.
Yes, that woman in literature and woman in history, yes, are both featured primarily in texts written by men here that reflect masculine concerns, right? So, to continue on in this paragraph here, right? For one often catches a glimpse of them in the lives of the great, whisking away into the background, concealing. I sometimes think a wink, a laugh, perhaps a tear. After all, we have lives enough of Jane Austen. It scarcely seems necessary to consider again the influence of the tragedies of Joanna Bailey upon the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. As for myself, I should not mind if the homes and haunts of Mary Russell Mitford were closed to the public for a century at least. But what I find deplorable, I continued, looking about the bookshelves again, is that nothing is known about women before the 18th century. I have no model in my mind to turn about this way and that. Here I am asking why women did not write poetry in the Elizabethan Age, and I am not sure how they were educated, whether they were taught to write, whether they had sitting rooms to themselves, how many women had children before they were 21, what in short they did from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. They had no money, evidently. According to Professor Trevelyan, they were married whether they liked it or not before they were out of the nursery, at 15 or 16 very likely. So where are the glimpses we can get, like what can we see of women in these histories written by men? Where do they appear?
Like, as for history, where do they appear?
Yeah.
Like as nurses or like helping men
Around the house.
in the house.
Yeah. So nursing, helping, never in the foreground, right?
Right. Never like in battle.
Yes, never in
Holding a
battle.
gun.
Yeah, well, and that's like there's a part of this that's not excerpted here, right? But that talks about exactly the kinds of topics that Professor Trevelyan, like it goes through a chapter listing of Professor Trevelyan's book, right? And the chapters are all things about politics and monasteries and battles, and things like things that are very much concerned with the activities of men, specifically with the activities of upper class men, right? And that the lives of ordinary people, especially ordinary women, are largely not of concern. So yeah, women in this version of history are treated primarily as background characters, right? You might catch a glimpse of one off to the side, but they're rarely at the center of events. This is not to say that this is how reality works, right? But this is how the writing of history often works and how it's like the writing of fiction, right? So there's a historian, and we're gonna wrap up with this, by the name of Hayden White. Died just a couple of years ago. He wrote a very important book called Meta-History. And what White argues in this book is that there's no such thing as like a real objective, purely fact-based history, because the historian has to rely on the same tools as the fiction writer, right? The historian has to choose perspective characters and has to select events and has to arrange them into a coherent order, like a coherent narrative, right?
And is also in his point of view.
Yeah, and it's often gonna choose these things in ways that consciously or unconsciously reflect a particular bias, right? And that's like it's impossible for human beings to avoid bias, right? We all see things through the lens of our own experience and our own opinions. So we can try to step back and be objective, but none of us are ever going to be able to do that 100%, right? But the reason I bring this up is because Woolf is making a very similar point, right? that the absence of women from history, and the reason why it's so difficult to imagine a Judith Shakespeare, is largely because, bless you,
Sorry.
again, women's experience has been misrepresented in literature and largely ignored in historical writing. All right, so that is all I got for you today. Anybody have any questions? I can see that we're, again, we're outdoors. We're all kind of at the end of our attention span here, so.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll let you go. Remember to read the Gloria Anzaldúa for next time.
Yes.
And we'll see you Thursday.